Today, action stations on the cash ban. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to the latest post covering finance and problem news with a distinctively Australian flavour. I'm joined again by Robbie Barwick from the CEC. Hi, Robbie.
Hi, Martin.
So it's countdown time. We've got 2 weeks to go.
Countdown. 2 weeks, 2 very important weeks. And the whole purpose of this discussion, we know a lot of people, human nature being what is, put off the job. The job at hand, I think regular viewers would know, newer viewers need to know, is making a submission to the Senate inquiry. And now's the time to stop putting it off and actually make the submission.
And just to re-emphasise, the previous submissions went into Treasury, right, about 4,000 yes. plus or minus. Haven't seen sight and sound of those, but that doesn't count, right? We have to actually start over and now go through the new route.
Yeah, an entirely different process, and that's the important thing. Now, if you need a motivation for objecting to where this is all heading, just look at the experience in the last 2 weeks where you've had multiple banks in Australia, their electronic systems fail in various ways. And where's this all going to lead? Now, I know, now the cash ban restricts cash up to only over $10,000. So you think, oh, well, that won't necessarily affect me. But
at the moment,
they are already lobbying to reduce it to 2. And Martin, I'm reliably informed that the banks are predicting, because they want it, total cashlessness by the mid-2020s, right? And I've heard the Commonwealth Bank has said something like this. Bank of America in the United States is also talking like this. This would be beautiful for the banks, right? If they can have a totally cashless society. And banks are very powerful. They're definitely pushing it. Yet when you're there, as we saw in the last 2 weeks, you're very vulnerable to all sorts of problems, right? It's crazy. Cash is legal tender. We need to fight for it. Let's make these submissions work.
Yeah, and just on that broader point, Robbie, 2 points. The first is that around the world, banks are actually arguing for the removal of cash as quickly as possible, and they argue it based on, well, it's costly to move it around and there are risks attached to it, etc., and electronic is more convenient, right? Well, that's okay if the electronic systems are 100% reliable, but we've had several failures recently, including one that touched multiple banks at the same time. We've had situations where ATMs have been unavailable as well. In fact, somebody sent me a clip today. They went to the local ATM, it was out of service. And this is the point, of course. And think about this. We've got a scenario potentially where there are areas where we've got bushfires and those sorts of things. Power, like in California, right? Power's been off for a week.
Exactly.
Now, imagine trying to do any type of commercial operations, or paying for things at the shop, if in fact power is off for a week. So it's critical that we don't allow cash to disappear completely. So, that's just a sort of a general logical statement about the fact that cash is really important. It's not the only means of making payment. And some people will say, I never use cash these days. But ask yourself the question, if power went out for a week, what would you do?
Yes. And the government has had to, if you read the explanatory memorandum of the bill, they've had to foreshadow those kind of scenarios and include exemptions to the law, which is a strict ban on all cash transactions over $10,000. They've had to insert exemptions to the law in the case of, power going out, a big fire crisis, flood crisis, etc. Why? Because those things do happen, right? And technically they become illegal. The way you respond to that becomes illegal under the law. It's better not to have the law in the first place.
Yeah, and the point, of course, is that if in fact, the cash transactions were made illegal, the chances are there'll be less cash in the system, which means there's essentially the chances of them pulling cash out and suddenly making it available. And, there are strategic reserves of cash in various places. The whole thing is dumb and stupid, yes. And the agenda is remove cash from the system because it's cheaper for the banks, means you've got to go through the banking system to make your transactions, and it enables negative interest rates later if you need it. And that's the other thing that nobody wants to talk about, but is a critical driver. Look at the IMF.
So what I would like to do, Martin, is give people broad instructions on making a submission.
Okay.
Right. So when you get to the end of this video, you, the viewer, please stop straight away and make your submission. And if you've wondered, we see lots of comments, how much about supposed to go about this. We're going to make it as simple for you as possible.
Yeah, right? and Robbie, and I think it's worth saying that, that there's clearly an emotional element to this. And we're not saying don't be emotional. But what we are saying is support it with facts and argument, yes, because that will be a whole lot more powerful, and it will just underscore how much sentiment there is out there in the community and how much people feel really strongly about it. But honestly, expletives and just saying it's a dumb thing to do actually doesn't help our cause, really.
No, don't. No, that's true. People shouldn't use expletives. We understand the anger that's there, but one of the reasons you don't want to do it that way is because it would be good if your submission was published, right? And because we want to force the government to publish thousands and thousands and thousands of these. That's part of the way these processes work. And they're not going to do that if there's abusive material in the submission, right? So that's not worthwhile. There's enough evidence that you can have to your view to cite it, to state it clearly, and just but be prepared to be absolutely prepared to express your anger that from a civil rights standpoint, but you don't have to go over the top. Yep. So anyway, here's what I suggest people do, and Martin, please comment at will on specific things. But first, really the real basics. It's probably easiest for most people to email your submission. Now, if you're computer literate, go to the website and use the upload facility by all means. But a friend of mine, Garth, who I've cited on this show before, Garth's very good value. Garth called the committee this week and asked about uploading versus emailing, and they said either is fine, right? And so emailing is much more straightforward. Incidentally, Martin, when Garth asked this question, he was told that he said, how many submissions have you been getting? He was told hundreds of each type, emails and uploads. And they didn't want to be specific. I suspect it's already into the thousands, right? Which is quite important. So here is the email. You email economics.sen@aph.gov.au, right? Send an email right there. Address it to Senate Standing Committee on Economics, PO Box 6100, Parliament House, Canberra, ACT 2600. Right, so and then it's just to whom it may concern. Right, that's all you do. Put that in the email, and then to whom it may concern. They'll know what it's about. In the subject line of the email, put cash ban law. Right, they can follow that enough. There are a number of issues you can cover, and choose to cover one or all of them, and emphasise the one that you're most connected to. Civil liberties is a very important issue in relation to this bill. Cash is legal tender, right? And you, by using cash, you have the right to privacy. You have the right to not use a bank if you don't want to. You restrict cash, you lose that right? It gets taken away. You should also have the right, or you should have the right, we Australians should fight for the right to not have the government and the banks monitor and measure our activities. Those are the words of the man who recommended this cash ban to the government, that we need to move people out of cash into the bank so we can monitor and measure their activities. Who do these people think they are, right? The civil liberties question is very, very important. Second, practical benefits of cash, and they are numerous. We've already touched on a few. Power supplies and communications not being reliable, for instance. Instant settlement of payments, which is good for commerce, good for discounts. Discounts especially. A friend of mine, and you may know her, Martin Genevieve Carrier, she put up on Twitter this week that the local independent petrol station owner was upset because his suppliers are demanding only electronic payments. And he complained to Genevieve, he's being pushed more and more into using the banks, and his bank charges have gone in the last 10 years have gone through the roof, right? Well, if cash is legal tender, he should have a right to settle in cash if he wants, right? And these are the things where what his suppliers are doing is not complying with the law yet, but they're complying with a system governed by the banks that's already pushing people in that direction. The law is just going to make it easier for them to do that. So that's it. Practical benefits of using cash. If you're someone who that affects, you state it in your email, right? Make it be very forceful in making that point. A lot of politicians. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, Robbie, it's worth emphasising. In the regional areas, we've got a lot of feedback that in regional areas like in agribusiness and those, cash is just part of the way that business is done, and it is just. That's the way it is. So there is no reason why that should change simply because somebody in Canberra has decided that that's no longer acceptable.
Well, I don't know. The farmer out there in the boondocks who's getting a visit from the purchaser from the Sydney markets or whatever, they can stand around and chew the grass while they're waiting for the satellite to get overhead so their communications works, and they can settle immediately then. Or the guy can just pull out the cash he's brought for the transaction and say, here you go, the farmer's happy, he gets to walk away, right? Yep. I mean, give us a break. So make that point, make it loud. That's the subject of practical benefits of cash. Oh, the other point I was going to make about that, do not assume that politicians pay attention to these things. As I've said before on this program, I get disgusted at how politicians seem to so quickly get enamored with all things new technology, right, and embrace it all, irrespective of the consequences. And then later on down the track, you see where it's been disastrous.
Well, Robbie, if all you're buying is a latte in Canberra, then waving your card's fine, right? But absolutely. The real world isn't like that.
Yes, and can I point out, Stephen Jones, the Labor spokesman, for the Assistant Treasurer, that was his first reaction to this bill. Oh, I don't use cash. No one uses cash. What does it matter? When you compare what he first said in the AFR a few months ago to what he said in Parliament last week when he made sure this bill went to the Senate inquiry, he's taking on board the complaints that have been directed at the Labor Party, right? So these are being heard. A third area to cover. The excuses for this law are false. We have absolutely smashed these excuses, right? Thanks to the work that John and you, Martin, did the first posts on the negative interest rate questions. The last few weeks I've been able to meet Melissa Harrison, who went through the Black Economy Task Force report. And I met Paul Wins on Saturday in Adelaide. We had a seminar in Adelaide, and Paul Wins is the gentleman who first revealed the Friedrich Schneider, Leandro Medina study of the black economy, right? So the official excuse for this law is eliminate the black economy, eliminate tax evasion, and neither are true. Eliminating the black economy will not work with this law. We've shown that. Australia already doesn't have a really serious problem anyway, and what we have in the last 19 years has been shrinking without any cash restrictions. And the countries in Europe that do have cash restrictions or are cashless have much bigger black economy problems and growing black economy problems. That's a furphy. That's a total farce. As for tax evasion, this will not solve tax evasion because individuals using cash are not the problem, right? I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Of course, there's a little bit of fringe on the side happens. That sort of thing happens everywhere. But real tax evasion that affects national budgets happens at a global level by the biggest corporations, biggest banks, and they're assisted by these big four auditing firms to do that, right? And one of these big four auditing firms, KPMG, is the main driver behind this law. And that part disgusts me to my core. I was telling someone the other day, when you're on this cash, because they want to make it about tax, there's a section in the Black Economy Task Force report where they say, we've got to change the culture of tradies avoiding tax. And they have these little Q&As to make their point. One of the Q&As is, the big end of town avoid tax, why shouldn't I? And the author of the report, Michael Andrew, the head of KPMG, which helps the big end of town avoid cash, his answer was, two wrongs don't make a right. Right? They got no intention of going after their own side. It's just to do, and that's unconscionable. You do not take away people's rights on such a fraud, right? So those are the things you should get angry about. Andrew Wilkie made the point in Parliament in his speech last week that the government currently has all the laws it needs to go after the real black economy and real tax evasion. They don't use them, right? And that's, this is why we have to be a brick wall on this. So the excuses for the law are false.
And I'll just add to that, Robbie, that there is a sort of the mythical 5 billion saving, right, which is quoted in that report, the original report. Yeah. And by the way, they're now saying they can't quantify the benefits. But that 5 billion is being claimed by all sorts of different initiatives, right, from banning cash and from changing directors' powers, etc., right? So, in fact, that doesn't add up. And then the second point is that 5 billion, as Melissa showed, included a one-off relating to a change in particular types of duty. So even that is a false number. So we're basing a false number on a false number on a false number. This is not a big problem.
The beauty of Melissa's work on the task force report is she shows how all their claims are so spurious because they're based on things like guesses rather than actual evidence. And what we've presented with the Medina Schneider study of the black economy, etc., is real evidence. So I'm assuming if you're not familiar with that evidence, we've got a website that people can look at now called stopthecashban.com.au. You can go to that, or you can go to the main CEC website. We have pages on this. Look at the evidence that we've presented on there in our media releases, etc. Right? Use some of that. I'm not saying everyone has to sit down now and write a multi-page submission. Just be confident. If you've heard these broadcasts before, just be confident in the evidence that we have and assert that, because you're one of many, many submissions, remember, right? And the main thing we're going to be achieving with that is so that all the politicians know when they're reading these submissions, that all the public know that the evidence that there is no evidential basis for this law, right? And then that's harder for them to get away with those arguments. Another issue to touch is on, as we've discussed, the real reason for this law. And we didn't make it up. The IMF stated it. You've got to keep people stuck in the banks. That's the real reason for this law, or else there are other policies, like especially negative interest rates, will not work. And it's there in black and white. What's the IMF website is called Cashing In. The post on their website in February this year, Cashing In, How to Make Negative Interest Rates Work. Just Google that. You'll see the post, and it's right there. Right? That's the real reason for this. And as we argue, because we're concerned about bail-in, it would achieve the same for bail-in. Bail-in cannot work if people can easily pull their money out of the bank. You trap them in banks, these policies, they can persist with these policies. And all these policies do is they're extreme measures designed to keep propping the system up for a little bit longer. Right? They prove that it's a broken system anyway. All right, the final point is a point that's starting to get through, that all the government's reassurances about this bill are effectively fake, if I can use that term, because they're not guarantees, because they're not in the bill. They're in regulations that can be easily changed. Now, Melissa Harrison took this fact check that the government released a fact sheet, $10,000 cash payment limit, myths and facts. And we identified the myths are so misleading it's not funny. These are things that no one that we know has really been worried about. But all the reassurances in regards to these so-called myths that the government was correcting are not reassurances because they can't be backed up. And Melissa just went through, did a fact check on them all, and Martin can put the graphic on the screen. You'll see what she said, and you can find it online, and just refuted quite easily what the government has said about this. Now, a different inquiry, a different Senate committee, Martin, called the Scrutiny of Bills Committee, has already had a look at this bill, and that's what they do. They have to look at all bills just to see if they breach human rights conventions and things. They've already had a look at this bill, and what they've shown in this bill, or what they've highlighted about this bill, is that very thing. This committee already expressed concern of why aren't the exemptions in the bill rather than in these regulations. And if their own Senate committee can raise that as a concern, that proves it's a very real concern, right? So those are the areas I would encourage people to touch on in your submission. And anything else you want to add in there that we haven't thought of, etc., put it in. The most important thing is make the submission, though. 2 weeks, make the submission.
And Robbie, I'd suggest also one other thing: advocate public hearings. Right?
Absolutely.
Because the Senate is quite capable, and has done in the past on other issues, having public hearings to hear from people. This is a classic example when they should do this, because it's really important that, the real quiet, silent Australian gets a chance to have a say on this critical piece of legislation, which, on so many fronts is just nutty, right? So that's the other thing I would say, just say, it's really important to have public hearings on this particular thing.
Public hearings would force them to truly examine the evidentiary basis for this, and the counter argument, and the evidence for the counter arguments. And I can tell you, the government's evidence would be found extremely wanting. It's one of the reasons I'm convinced the Treasury did not publish its submissions. Right? Yep. It's already very, very flimsy.
And then the final point to make is, think about how this would actually, if it did go through, right? How would it be monitored? How would it be implemented, right? So think about the degree of snooping that will be required to be able to confirm a transaction or not confirm a transaction, and understand how that takes us closer to a state that is really controlled. And that is something that we don't want.
No, that's Big Brother for you. And I'm glad you raised that, because even that Scrutiny of Bills Committee, that was the second thing they raised in relation to this bill. Why the 2-year jail sentence? Why such an extreme penalty? Well, I know why. Because KPMG let the cat out of the bag. To make something like this stick, you've got to make an example of people, right, and hit them with an extreme penalty. And because in a sense, you want people to police themselves. But it's a big step down the path to Big Brother.
And the penalty is massive, right? So it's multiply larger than the $10,000 we're talking about, and jail potentially as well. And on that 10,000, it's just worth reflecting that, that is not in the regulation, it's actually in the bill. But of course, that can be changed through Parliament. And as we saw with the APRA powers that were brought in through the back door, it doesn't necessarily require full debate in either house before it goes into law. So even there are political tricks that can be used to lower that hurdle, even if it's not in the regulation.
Because can I comment on that? I'm not sure people appreciate how easily the government can get legislation through without even most of the Parliament knowing. And I know we were the front line of the fight against the bail-in law in 2018. So when they finally went to the House and the Senate, just a handful of MPs and senators in each. But I know when Scott Morrison introduced the bill, he called it technical amendments. Right, just downplayed it as a boring bill. Lots of boring bills go through Parliament that way, because politicians are run off their feet and are distracted by all sorts of things. So that's what they called it. That particular week, Barnaby Joyce was his scandal had broke, right? And I remember we had a bunch of meetings with Nationals, and they all cancelled their meetings because they were scared of the media. So there was a massive distraction in Parliament that week to combine. But subsequent to that, I had a Labor member of Parliament and a Liberal member of Parliament both express that they had absolutely no idea that this had gone through, yet it had to go through their caucus process first, and they kept it under wraps from that, right? So in the future, because you've got KPMG already lobbying to reduce to 10,000, right? If this bill gets passed, and they decide in 6 months or a year's time, no, we're going to reduce it to 2,000 or 1,000 or 500 or whatever, right? And they can pass it off as technical amendments, and there's something else going on, and they don't, and they keep the MPs distracted, right? And they release the bill, amending this bill, after 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and during a World Cup final or something, like all the tricks they play, right? So that you or me or this time a guy in North Africa doesn't accidentally stumble across it like he did with this bill. I don't know if people know that. A gentleman in North Africa who's an anti-money laundering campaigner is the man who discovered this bill and brought it to the attention of our group in Australia who've made an issue of it, right? Because we didn't even notice it at the time. that's the sort of tricks the government can pull. And, you can wake up and be told, oh, it's now $2,000 limit. All right. So, this is, and people have to be absolutely clear that it's possible to do it that way. That's why we have to shine them the light of scrutiny on this now and fight really hard to stop it. One of the things that I'll warn people about also, Martin, is that the Labor Party has done the right thing so far, but it's sort of in their DNA to compromise, and they'll take the approach I'm predicting of maybe amending this bill to make it more palatable. That would be a very bad outcome. I don't see how you can amend a bill like this, right? What we need to do, we have a window of opportunity with these submissions in the next 2 weeks, and then what we do between the end of the 15th and the 7th of February, the 15th of November and the 7th of February, to make such a stink about this that Scott Morrison decides it's better to withdraw the bill. It's not worth it. He's already got an insurrection in the Liberal Party, inside the Liberal Party membership. We know that, right? And we have to fuel that insurrection. Now, I've received reports in the last few days about delegations going to members of Parliament, and they've been brilliant, right? I mean, one MP had 6 people on his doorstep, right? And I can tell you, he was very shocked. All these 6 people, and they all had a say, right? Bang, bang, bang. There's one near north of Sydney there. He was there's at least 6 people want to meet him, and he said, "Why so many? Why can't I just meet 3 of you or 2 of you?" Right? But already that tells you, it makes an impression on them. So if you want to be part of a delegation, as I've said before, that's a big part of this process as well. That we'll do that going forward, and we'll keep the heat on, or increase the heat in those ways. But for now, make this submission. Rewind this tape, right? Go through the steps. Put it in your own words and send it off, fire it off as fast as possible.
Yep, and we'll put some links and some dot points below the post as well so that people can actually go directly to it to help. But to obviously use your own words, because it'll be much more powerful if you effectively just reinterpret and make your own points around some of those points or around whatever points you want to make. But this is a really, really critical point, a critical time. We've got a couple of weeks. Grab your pen, grab your PC, make the submission. It can make a huge difference.
Absolutely.
Robbie, I appreciate your time today, and we'll keep pushing.
Martin. Yep. 2 weeks to go.
See you soon.
Yeah.
So there you have it. I hope that will help facilitate your submission. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.